What the CPE does is make very explicit and very visible the everyday work of teachers, which at its best is a combination of theory and practice, but in the workplace.
It gives us an opportunity to probe the robustness of the thinking of the candidate.
Many of the teacher candidates would say it's a turning point for them in the year. It's when they actually understand what it looks like to be a clinical interventionist practitioner.
The examiners need to ask the question, would you have this person teaching your children? And if the answer's no, then we've got to ask why not.
The clinical praxis exam is a key teaching, learning and assessment tool within the Master of Teaching programs at the University of Melbourne's Graduate School of Education. It was introduced into the secondary program in 2010. Originally named the Combined Assessment Task, or CAT, it replaced 3 individual tasks in each of the 3 core subjects in the first semester of the program. The first of these subjects examined the social and policy context of education through a sociological lens. The second examined learning, teaching and pedagogy through a psychological lens. And the third examined language and literacy across the school curriculum from a functional linguistic lens.
The beauty of the CP is that it incorporates all these different aspects of everything you're studying. So obviously it's your method areas that you're studying in, and then it's got the other 3 core subjects that you have to incorporate the whole thing. And that's effectively what teaching is. It's incorporating all your learning and all these different aspects in together.
Many of the early discussions centred on how subjects emerging from and emphasising different and often contradictory philosophical, theoretical and ideological standpoints could come together in one task in a meaningful way. Rather than sink into polemics around the purposes of education and the limits of each field, the early designers moved from seeking to establish which general field or subject was right or the best, to asking what each field and subject contributes to education, teaching and learning in broad terms. The early designers learnt to value the differences among and within their respective fields and sought to draw out and strengthen the differences rather than reduce them. From the beginning, the team wanted to avoid the possibility of developing a new set of orthodox practices or a way of thinking. Instead, they hoped to work with all staff in the program to focus on student learning, curriculum work, and literacy and discursive work in the context of their weekly practice in schools. That is, the team sought to work with teacher candidates on their terms and in their context to try to understand what happened for them and the students in their classrooms, what they learnt and understood, how they responded and why, and to assist them in developing as independent, intelligent practitioners who were theoretically informed, who entered into conversations about their practice with other professionals, who made informed decisions based on a range of formal and informal evidence, and who understood teaching as a form of praxis that was ongoing. While there are any number of programs that attempt to do the same, we wanted to develop a structure in which theory, practice, context, discourse, language, the individual student and the broader class and community was endlessly taken into account without privileging one aspect over the other.
The subject of my CPE was a Year 11 female student who had a difficulty studying for tests, and the subject was business management. So I had to design a series of test-taking sort of tips and trainings for study skills. So that was what my CPE was about. It was an intervention that I planned to help the class with test-taking tips and study tips, and just my reflections on that intervention.
First of all, I just made observations in my classroom, and not so formal observations, just thought maybe this student has a problem here, or perhaps that's something that we could improve over there. And then you just start talking. It's all about getting a dialogue with your mentor teacher, talking about what strengths and weaknesses there might be in the classroom, or whether you think there's an issue and whether they can corroborate it. And then once you sort of confirm that with your mentor teacher, you look at gathering other evidence as well in terms of setting assignments or doing formative assessment. And finally, after you get all that evidence together, then you can start to draft up your interventions.
In June 2010, 420 teacher candidates sat the first examination. Each candidate was given 15 minutes to outline the context in which they taught, aspects of the context that impacted on and informed their curriculum and pedagogical decision-making, the steps they took to identify the language and literacy demands of the area they were teaching, what students already knew and could do and how this was determined, the area of achievement they were targeting, the series of steps they took to support students to get there, observations and modifications during the implementation period, justifications of their decisions based on research and evidence, and then a critical reflection of their practices and the outcomes before giving an indication of where they might go next if they were still teaching the class. After their report, a panel of 3 asked questions designed to probe the teacher candidates' thinking around their observations, evidence from the field and in literature, and the decisions they made.
As part of the clinical exams, a really central part is the questioning of academic staff of the candidates. So it's a lovely situation for the candidate in that they are able to present, but then they're able to have a conversation in a professional way with colleagues, with their lecturers, to talk about the judgments they'd made for an individual learner and to really tease out some of the implications of that.
If you accept that the CPE is the central point of the year when our teacher candidates realise what it looks like to be doing what we've been talking about, then I guess you'd have to say it's had a massive impact.
We're really inspired by the presentations in the clinical exam, and I guess it's a real test of clinical judgment and the ability to actually enunciate and articulate why you've done certain things in the classroom. And it's not just because it worked or just because it seemed like the right idea at the time. There's actual evidence of learning that we're looking at.
The early designers quite intentionally decided upon an oral report as a way of supporting teacher candidates to learn to speak publicly about their practice in theoretically informed and intelligent ways. Early feedback from a number of principals who interviewed graduates for positions in their schools indicated that Melbourne graduates were able to speak about their practice in highly intelligent, reflective and theoretically informed ways.
We actually wanted students to talk about their practice. We wanted them to be able to report back to us about their interventionist practice, particularly with an individual within a classroom context.
It's one thing to present a lesson in a class, but whether that was based on sound pedagogical principles or theoretical knowledge or appropriate understanding of developmental sequences in the subject area and so on.
By the end of 2010, it was apparent that the task was more than merely a form of assessment that combined assessment tasks from 3 subject areas. The task began to impact on each of the subjects in different ways. For example, in learners, teachers and pedagogy, it became apparent that teacher candidates needed more than a general understanding of what various theorists have understood as learning, how people learn and pedagogical approaches that assist teaching and learning. What students already knew and could do, how judgments could be made about this, and ways in which to gather and utilise feedback became an important part of the subject. In social and professional contexts, the curriculum and pedagogical implications of difference began to be explored in closer detail. In language and teaching, the functional linguistic emphasis on subject-specific discourses across the secondary years expanded to acknowledge the fundamental role of language as a mediatory tool in teaching, that no intervention exists outside language. So too, other subjects within the course began to change in response to the task. At the end of 2010, it was decided that the name would be changed to Clinical Praxis Exam, or CPE.
I actually was fully engaged with the task, and I thought, this is actually quite genius, because now that I am a teacher, the CPE, the thought process itself, is what I go through to diagnose and to a learning need and to intervene. So I might not set up a PowerPoint presentation and write references and all of that, but it's the same thought process. And I think if we weren't exposed to that thought process, we won't really be able to deal with learning needs in our classroom as teachers.
The practice is about looking at the individual in the wider group, and it's smaller groups within the group, and that differentiation isn't necessarily having 25 totally separate programs, but it's having that mindset that you can work with 1, with 3 and with the whole lot and still be impacting all of them.
The CP overall, I think was actually really beneficial in terms of it made me think about what I was doing in the classroom. So it added that extra context that instead of going into the classroom and just trying to teach the content that I needed to teach, I also realised that I had to be gathering evidence, thinking about interventions and getting my message across to the students that needed it. So I think it helped with my actual teaching of the classes.
Staff with years of experience are finding themselves energised and learning from working with the teacher candidates in a new way. That our teacher candidates make a very rapid progress to being a more finished professional product earlier than perhaps they had in the past.
You're going to be conveying your knowledge in learning communities with other staff, so we try as much as possible to make assessment here authentic to the lives of teachers and to really prepare our teacher candidates to be the teacher that they're going to be when they move into the profession. We don't want any surprises.
It is a very important pivotal point in making their work real and in many ways I'd say authentic. A lot of them adopt it as their internal model from then on. Going
into the CPE, naturally I was nervous, but at the same time you don't feel like you're going to get caught out, or you're not too worried about slipping up because it's what you've been doing for the whole semester.
But once you do it, that thought process becomes an automatic part of your thinking, and that's what it achieved. So I think it's a fantastic task.